Back in August 2021, we announced that February 2022 was going to be a big problem for video games, and lo and behold, we were right. With small companies having to jockey for position against the big titles that were coming out, your Horizon Forbidden Wests, your Elden Rings, which is out in a couple of days. But behind all the big shiny trailers and the big shiny titles, things aren't going so well for the video games industry in general, as companies still continue to try and take our hard-earned cash from us and give us, in some cases, very inferior products, and in other cases, what ultimately, years down the line, might amount to nothing at all. Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to Gossy News. And we're going to start off with that whole idea of nothing at all. Last week, we were talking about Nintendo closing their eShop for 3DS and the Wii-U. Now, a lot of people have been talking about this story in the context of video games preservation, and one of the organisations who have raised their voices in concern about the closure of the Wii U and 3DS digital stores is the Video Game History Foundation. They have posted on Twitter saying, as a paying member of the Entertainment Software Association, Nintendo actively funds lobbying that prevents even libraries from being able to provide legal access to these games. Not providing commercial access is understandable, but preventing institutional work to preserve these titles on top of that is actively destructive to video game history. We encourage ESA members like Nintendo to rethink their position on this issue and work with existing institutions to find a solution. I actually am glad that they're stepping up and calling Nintendo out for their bullshit, because it's bullshit, Nintendo, and you know it. And the reason why I know it's bullshit is because of another aspect of this, which is all about video games ownership. Where the video games ownership aspect comes into play is because, according to an article in Nintendo Life, Nintendo have been planning to close the Wii U eShop since 2014. Now, this is according to a former employee of Nintendo of America who has stated that Nintendo knows it has to support a product for a minimum of 10 years or they risk some class action. Internally, Nintendo Company Limited has been waiting for that day since 2014 based on sales. Nintendo looks at the first 2 years as the indicator of when to start packing it in with a console. Now, that might sound shocking to a lot of people, but it is one of those things that a lot of companies do tend to do. They do try and plan for controlled closure of digital stores and various things like that as a method to manage things. But here's where I have a big problem with this. A lot of companies do these things in advance, but that also gives you years, in this case 8 years or 9 years in the case of the 3DS, to basically organize systems and have things in place so that all of those games that are potentially going to disappear forever would not disappear forever. You would have an archive of sorts, or you would have some kind of system in place where people could continue to access the digital products that they've purchased on those consoles that are only available on those consoles. Or you could get bodies like the Video Game History Foundation involved, work with them to actually form libraries online where people could access their games still, or even try new ones. People are still interested in video games history. And in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, when people talk about the old days of video games, we don't want them to be talking about 20, 30 years previously. We want them to look back to the beginnings of video games history. And that includes the stuff that you, Nintendo, have released right at the beginning. So we want them to look back at the old grandstand consoles where it was just a dial controller, or the old Ataris. We want them to know about the history of video games, not just on consoles, but on computers as well. So the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, things like that. We want them to know where video games came from. And you, Nintendo, as a company that is at the forefront of that medium, have a duty of care to preserve the heritage of video games. That is your responsibility. Just like Hollywood has the Academy Museum of Motion Picture, which is the largest museum in the US that's dedicated to the art and the science and the technology that goes into making movies, video games deserve the same thing. Video games is the biggest entertainment industry on the planet, and companies at the forefront of that, Microsoft, Sony, Tencent, Nintendo, EA, Ubisoft, Activision Blizzard, you have a duty of care to preserve video game history. It's your responsibility. You have to lead. Okay, opening angry rant over. Let's have a bit of fun. So, who can we poke with a stick? EA. EA are always fun to poke with a stick. And this time, well, in a recent town hall meeting with their employees, EA acknowledged the disappointing launch of Battlefield 2042, and Laura Meal, EA's chief studios officer, said the company failed to meet the expectations of our players and also clearly missed our own expectations. Now, when she was identifying the reasons for the game's failure, she attributed part of the blame to the huge ambitions of the project, the global pandemic, which created unexpected variables, things like that. That's fine. But where things become a little bit more confusing is when she states that unfair comparisons with Halo Infinite were one of the reasons why Battlefield 2042 failed. Because apparently the game was stable upon release and early critical reception was good. Not sure where this early critical reception she's talking about has come from, considering that a substantial amount of the positive feedback that they allegedly received from players was also tempered with even more feedback concerning bugs and unpolished areas within the game. So instead of holding their hands up and taking responsibility for releasing a broken-ass game, EA executives seem bound and determined to blame someone else for their failures. Which, interestingly enough, is a nice little segue into the second part of this EA coverage, because EA's CEO, Andrew Wilson, has claimed that EA has been impeded by the FIFA brand. Yeah, you heard that right. Now, this kind of blows my mind, this entire story. According to an anonymous source to Video Game Chronicle, Andrew Wilson claimed that FIFA had precluded EA from expanding the base football game into modes beyond traditional 11 versus 11 or broader digital ecosystems, and suggested that the only value EA got from the license in a non-World Cup year was 4 letters on the front of the box. Now, EA have declined to comment about this story, but my God, EA's success is built on the foundations of sports games like FIFA. And for decades, the reason why EA has continued to be able to have money to invest in other projects is because of FIFA and other games like FIFA. Do you all remember the adverts? EA Sports, it's in the game. All of those sports games that they kept coming out with. I'm sorry, but if you want to go and make bizarre football games and do things like that, instead of giving people who love the game of football exactly what they want, which is to play football on their consoles against their friends, then go for your life. Give someone else the FIFA brand. I'm sure Konami are just chomping at the bit to negotiate with FIFA and have all of those teams and all of those brands and all of those names going to play eFootball. Maybe that's something we'll see. Or maybe FIFA will actually get its act together and start investing in its own software and games development and have their own football brand, so they'll no longer need to rely on EA. Maybe that's a thing that can happen. I'm amazed it hasn't happened already, but maybe they've been hamstrung by their contract with EA. Personally, I think that if this story is true, then EA have really shot themselves in the foot. Because a major brand like FIFA doesn't come around very often, and once you've lost it, you've lost it. We come back to this thing. I thought these people at the top were supposed to be good at business, but you keep putting your foot in it for some reason. Anyway, moving on to another company that keeps putting its foot in it for some reason. And yes, you guessed it, it is Activision Blizzard. See, federal and state regulators have sent more subpoenas as their probes grow wider in the investigation into misconduct at Activision Blizzard. Now, this is according to the Wall Street Journal. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, the DFEH, who were the first ones to actually start investigating this as a legal thing, they've sent additional subpoenas as their investigations continue. And although Activision Blizzard claims to be cooperating with the SEC investigation, they are resisting vehemently the DFEH probe. And I think that's because the DFEH probe is actually looking at things that are truly, truly illegal and you can actually go to prison for. Whereas the SEC, well, they're a government agency that's tasked with protecting investors and maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets. So they're not really going to investigate accusations of sexual misconduct, harassment, gender pay discrimination, gender discrimination, that sort of thing. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal's new report, the DFEH has now subpoenaed Activision's directors and has also subpoenaed police departments in Los Angeles to see if they have any records related to Kotick or 18 other current and former Activision Blizzard employees. But an Activision spokesperson has told the Wall Street Journal that the subpoenas to the police departments were an extraordinary fishing expedition. Do you know, the interesting thing about all this is that back in November, when that explosive report came out, Phil Spencer said that Microsoft was going to reevaluate its relationship with Activision Blizzard. And apparently, the very next day was when they basically decided they were going to buy Activision Blizzard. Which is a nice little segue because it does lead me on to another company who have discussed the idea of a potential buyout, which is Ubisoft. With Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard and Sony buying Bungie and Take-Two buying Zynga and various other companies like Embracer Group and that buying other companies, they're kind of feeling left out in the cold. When you talk about companies, publishers that are going to be purchased, they're not even in the conversation, and I think they're feeling that a little bit. Now, back in 2015, Ubisoft made a point of their desire to remain independent as they tried to fight off an apparent takeover bid by Vivendi. But with the release of the third quarter earnings, Ubisoft's CEO Yves Guillemot and CFO Frédéric Duguay seem to be striking a very different tone about the whole issue of takeovers and buyouts. We've always taken our decisions in the interest of our stakeholders, which are our players, employees and shareholders, says Guillemot. So Ubisoft can remain independent. We have the talent, the industrial and the financial skill, and a large portfolio of powerful IP. Having said that, if there were an offer to buy us, the board of directors would of course review it in the interest of all stakeholders. Now, just to add a little bit more spice to this, during the investment call for the third quarter earnings, they were asked specifically why Ubisoft hasn't yet received an offer given the value of their IP. Now, I find it hilarious that Ubisoft's investors are actually thinking, why does no one want to buy us? And I do have opinions on why no one wants to buy Ubisoft, but I'm not going to go into them at this moment in time. Moving on to some news that doesn't involve investment calls and financials and things like that, Sony have finally, officially announced the PlayStation VR 2 headset. In a blog post, the company showcased a first look at the device with a new headset and matching controllers. The new design is apparently lighter than the first PSVR device and features things like a lens adjustment dial, so players can alter the lens distance between their eyes and the headset, which is actually a really good thing. It also has a new ventilation system to let the air out, and overall just seems like a more complete package than the original PSVR. I am really happy that Sony are investing into VR in a big way. From my perspective, VR is one of the future avenues for video games. Not just consoles and PC, but VR as well. And not just for games, for movies and concerts and all sorts of other things like that as well. There are so many things that could be possible with virtual reality. The problem is that the whole concept of VR has been tarnished by things like The Matrix and Ready Player One and stuff like that. So we have a very distorted view of what VR could be. And it's frustrating. So here we are at our penultimate story, and 2K have secured the LEGO license for a large range of sports games, which is going to kick off with a football game developed by Sumo Digital. That's going to be followed with an open-world LEGO racing game currently in development at Visual Concepts, who are the studio responsible for WWE 2K22. The football title should be released later on this year to coincide with the FIFA World Cup, and I, for one, am very, very, very curious how the football game is going to work, because all I can keep thinking of are those weird, semi-comedic, mascot-based football games that you see, like Mario Charge Football and Mario Strikers and other things like that. That's all I can see in my head when it comes to a LEGO football game. I honestly cannot see it being a serious football game contender to something like FIFA, but still, it might be fun to play as an alternative to FIFA. You never know. And finally, some Final Fantasy news for you. Last Friday was the producer's live letter with Naoki Yoshida and some of the other people who work at Square Enix, and they were talking about the future patches 6.1 onwards that are coming out post Endwalker and various other things, and taking questions from people who were commenting on the stream. All well and good. Now, wish more video games developers, especially in the MMO space, communicated with their audience and their players in the way that Naoki Yoshida and Square Enix have done with Final Fantasy. That is a great thing to see, so hats off to them for that. Now, there were several areas that have been talked about a lot within MMO communities and on YouTube and on streams and various things like that, the graphical upgrades and the new dungeons and all sorts of stuff like that. But one of the areas that I think has been severely overlooked is that Naoki Yoshida has basically committed Square Enix to PS4 support all the way up to the next expansion, possibly a little bit beyond that. And the reason for that is actually pretty straightforward. It's because there haven't been enough PS5s to go around, so a lot of people who don't play on PC are playing on their PS4s and their PS4 Pros. Now, some of you may be wondering why I wanted this as the last story, and the reason why is because it makes a nice little parallel to the very first story with Nintendo. Yes, okay, they're not the same thing, but there is a connection that you can make, and that is about legacy support. See, what is happening in the MMO space when you move on to a new system and you upgrade the game to work on newer systems, you support the old system for a while, but you can still play the game on those new systems, which is what I would hope would happen with companies like Nintendo and stuff like that. Backwards compatibility would be a thing, so those games would continue to be supported on newer and newer systems, or that companies like Nintendo would actually create their own emulators that we could use on computers or on other consoles that could allow us to play those older games, thereby making those games continue to exist for people to enjoy for decades to come. Instead, what they have is a very, very, very narrow field of view, which I think is going to come back and bite them in the ass once people start realizing that they paid for something that they don't truly own. So basically, they paid for nothing. I'm going to leave things there for today. Let me know what you thought about all of the stories that we covered in the comments below. I will see you all on the next episode of Gosu News, or maybe sooner in Impossible Mission. We shall see. Until then, thanks for watching.